Hi, I'm Mike Chumley from the Neurobiology of Aging Labs at TCU. This video is another introductory video to teach students a little bit about another mechanism to cut very thin tissue sections. It's called cryotomy. We use a machine called a cryostat in which the chamber is frozen. The sections we're going to cut are actually going to be at minus 18 degrees Celsius. And the procedure is simple. We actually have fixed tissue. We do not go through paraffin processing of the tissue. These are tissues that are in an aqueous fixative solution like formalin. We sink those tissues in 30% sucrose. This cryoprotects the tissue so that ice crystals do not form inside of the cells. Then we take that piece of tissue, we put it in a solution called OCT that stands for optimal cutting temperature, and it's a viscous solution that will freeze in the cryostat. We wait for the tissues to freeze. Generally, we wait for about an hour, and then we will use this machine to cut very thin 8 micron thick tissue sections, and we will fix those onto a microscope slide. Now, the difference between this process and the paraffin processing is that the tissues are already in an aqueous solution, and we never take them out of that aqueous solution. There's no paraffin involved in this. Oftentimes, this is a much faster mechanism to cut thin sections. But one of the downsides to this mechanism is that the tissue sections do not stick to the slides as well, and oftentimes you will lose the tissue sections when you do downstream staining.
The process of cryosectioning involves 4 main steps. First of all, we're going to take some fixed tissue. This will have been fixed in formalin or paraformaldehyde, and we're going to put that tissue into a test tube that includes phosphate buffered saline and 30% sucrose. Now, this is a cryoprotectant step. What's going to happen is your tissue will float on the top of the PBS sucrose solution because the solution is more dense than the liquid inside of the cells of the tissue. But over time, it will equilibrate and your tissue will start to sink. We carry this step out at a 4-degree fridge. And once your tissue has sunk in the cryoprotectant solution, then we can now freeze the tissue. We place the tissue into a plastic mold and we surround it by a thick, sticky solution called OCT, which stands for optimal cutting temperature. Once the tissue is surrounded by OCT, we can freeze it, and there are many different ways that we can freeze it, but generally speaking, the safest way to freeze it is to just place it in the cryostat chamber. Inside the chamber will be a temperature somewhere between minus 17 and minus 20 degrees Celsius. So we sit the mold inside of the chamber and we wait for it to freeze, 45 minutes to an hour. Once the tissue is frozen, we can then set up the cryostat. This involves sticking your block of tissue onto the chuck and placing a very sharp blade in the cryostat and basically getting all your slides ready and so forth. Then we can start sectioning. So sectioning, we will cut individual sections one at a time, whatever thickness that you are looking for, and there are a number of different processes that involve different thicknesses of tissue. But generally speaking, we can cut 10, even 8 micron thick sections on the cryostat. Every time you cut a section, you have to stick it to a slide. And so you'll see in the video, we will cut a section, stick it to a slide, cut another section, stick it to a slide, etc. In order to do the procedure, you need a number of different items. First of all, you need the cryoprotectant solution and you need your tissue. You will need a cryo mold. So these are thin plastic molds that can easily be split down the corners with a razor blade in order to remove your frozen tissue. We will surround the tissue in this mold with OCT. We also need microscope slides to receive the thin sections. We need gloves to protect your hands, and because the chamber of the microtome is very cold, a lot of people like to double glove in this situation. we need the microtome blades. Now, these are different than the microtome that we previously cut paraffin sections with, because the device has a different, holds a different size blade. So they're still very sharp blades. They are a higher profile, so they're wider so that they fit in our machine. You will need 100% ethanol. We always keep a squirt bottle of 100% ethanol around. The reason for this is anytime you touch a surface inside the cryostat, you will warm that surface. And OCT, when it touches the warmer surface, will stick and leave a sticky residue on there. So we keep the ethanol around so that we can clean off surfaces that we might happen to touch while performing the sectioning process. We also need an anti-roll glass that prevents the tissue from rolling up after you cut it. So you will see in the video that if you cut without one of these anti-roll devices, the tissue just rolls up into a tight tube, and it's not usable then. You can't unroll it. So what we do is we keep our own piece of glass, and we just replace the glass every time we cut. The glass of the anti-roll device needs to have really, really sharp, clean edges. And so because this glass will be in a frozen environment, it breaks really easily. Little nicks along the edge will cause a nightmare when you try to cut thin sections and prevent them from rolling up. So we try to really take care of our glass piece that goes in there. We remove it when we're done. We clean it off. We store it. When we get ready to cut sections again, we take our piece of glass and put it back in the device. So you'll see this in the video. And then finally, you need that special pen that is alcohol resistant. You'll write whatever information you need on your slides. Always it will include the animal number, so you know what animal these tissue sections came from. And all of these reagents and devices that you need are stored in multiple places in the lab, so you will learn where to find those as you proceed with this process.
Okay, so one of the first things we have to do is sink our tissue in a cryoprotecting solution. It's 30% sucrose in a 1x PBS solution. So we just make this up and keep it cold all the time. And so you would take some sort of a test tube. We have a bunch of these plastic tubes in the lab, and you would just put some 30% sucrose in here. You need a piece of tissue and forceps and scissors to cut your tissue. Now, this is no different than what we did for the paraffin processed tissue, so I'm not going to actually cut another piece of tissue. I don't need to sink any right now to do anything. So rather than waste the tissue, I'm just going to explain that once you have the tissue and you put it into a 30% sucrose solution, it will float. And the reason it floats is because the tissue is an aqueous tissue, so it's basically water inside the cells, but here we have basically water with 30% sucrose, so this is a lot more dense. And so the tissue will float on top. And then you put these, however many of them you do, you put them in the refrigerator and you let them sit until they sink. And so what that looks like is, here is a piece of liver tissue that's in 30% sucrose now. And you can see here's the top of the liquid up here at the 10 mil mark. And there's our tissue down at the bottom. And I can get this moving around in here, and you see that the tissues all sink. So when this occurs, that means that you now have equilibrated the solution inside of the tissue with the solution outside of the tissue. So now you've got a 30% sucrose. It's more dense inside the cells now. And the benefit of this is it usually, not always, but it usually prevents the formation of ice crystals in your tissue when you freeze it. And so it's now at this point when you can dump out the sucrose, remove your tissue, and then we move on to the freezing step of the process. Okay, so one of the first things we do after we have placed our tissue in 30% sucrose is we're going to embed the tissue in a compound called OCT, or optical cutting compound. It's just a very thick, viscous solution that will freeze when we put it in the cryostat. So before I start, I want to take my special pen and I want to make sure that I put the animal number on my little mold. This is what we're going to freeze in. That animal number is the same animal number that's on my tube. And so to begin, I'm going to put a little bit of this OCT down in the bottom of the cup. I'm not going to fill it. I'm just going to put a little bit down at the bottom. So you can see that there's a little bit in the bottom. Then one of the things you should do, and I didn't do, is it's always good to have a paper towel here. The OCT is really sticky and it gets on the surface and sometimes it's hard to get off of there. So I'm gonna do it without the OCT so there's a lot more contrast and you can see what I'm doing, but I'm gonna keep my paper towel handy in case I make a mistake. Okay, so here's my piece of tissue. I'm going to go in and grab that tissue. The other advantage to having the paper towel is I'm going to dry this off a little bit on the paper towel. Now, the tissue is fixed in this case. This isn't fresh out of the animal. It's been in formalin for a while, so it's fairly rigid. And now I'm going to take this piece of tissue and I'm going to put it in my OCT solution and I'm going to push it down so that it sits on the bottom of the mold. And then I'm going to take and fill it back up with OCT. And so this tissue will have OCT all around it. It can be kind of hard to show it, but I'll try. There it is, down in the bottom. Air bubbles are a killer, so you want to try not to have air bubbles in there. The place that they're a problem is if you have air bubbles that are right next to your tissue. That's why I put the tissue down into the OCT first, and then I slowly pushed it down into the solution so that if there were air bubbles forming, they would move along the edges of the tissue and then be at the top of the tissue. So there's a couple of air bubbles in here now, but they're on the very top surface, so they're not going to affect anything. So after you put your tissue in the OCT, then it needs to go into the cryostat and we're going to let it freeze slowly. So there's multiple ways to freeze the tissue. It often depends upon whether, it depends on the type of tissue. So we've found that this tissue that we're doing here, which is a piece of liver, it freezes best if you freeze it fairly slowly. So the inside of the cryostat is set somewhere around minus 18 degrees Celsius. And so we'll put it in there and let it freeze slowly in that machine. Okay, this is our cryostat setup. So the cryostat is used to cut very thin sections of frozen tissue. And so what you'll see here is the big machine with the lab chair sitting in front of it. That's the cryostat. Inside there's a chamber that is currently at minus 19 degrees Celsius. All of the cutting is done inside of there, and that's also where you freeze your tissue. Sitting on top of the cryostat is a warm box, a slide warmer. When we pick up the frozen tissue sections, we'll end up putting the slide on the slide warmer. That warms up the slide and tends to make the tissue section stick better to the slide. I also already have pre-labeled slides up on top, so when I get ready to demonstrate the actual cutting procedure, I'll grab one of those slides and you'll be able to see more clearly. But I have several slides up there. They've all been labeled with our special lab marker with the animal number. On the cart next to it, we have a little card in here, and you can put all the extra stuff you need. So there's extra slides, there's our special marker, there's more of that OCT solution that is used to harden around the outside of the tissue. We've got some ethanol to clean with and some Kim wipes to clean with. So I'll be grabbing a number of these items while we're working inside of the machine. On the right-hand side of the machine, you can see a lever. That lever actually has a lock on it, so you can lock the cutting device in certain positions, but it's also what's used. Every crank of that machine, or of that knob, moves the tissue so you can get new sections. And so you won't be able to see that when I'm demonstrating what's going on inside of the machine, but every time you see a cut taking place, it's because I'm manually moving that lever on the right-hand side. Okay, here we are inside of the cryostat. So I went ahead and opened up the canister so you can see in here. Let me explain a few things. So this little plate on this surface right here is what your tissue piece is going to come out onto. This thing is at minus 18 degrees Celsius right now. There's a blade in here. We always put in our own blade when we're cutting, and so you can loosen the device that holds the blade, and the blade comes out. So we normally put our own blade in here every time we go to cut. I use little paint brushes to move it so that I'm not cutting my finger. And then once it's in place, you just lock down this lever, and now your blade will not move. Also in here is a glass plate on this little arm. It's called an anti-roll plate. And what it does is, when it's adjusted properly, it prevents the tissue from rolling up. So if I move this and I try to cut, my tissue will just roll up as I'm cutting it. But if I have this anti-roll bar down, the tissue, when it cuts, it goes underneath the glass plate and it stays flat. Now, it takes adjustment. There's a little set screw right here, and it's spring-loaded on this side. And so when you adjust it, you can actually move this thing in and out based on how tight you turn this little knob. So I'm going to have to do that in order to set it up so that my tissue sections fit under the anti-roll plate and won't roll up. The other thing we have here is this big cutting head right here that moves up and down, and we crank a wheel on the right-hand side of the machine, and every time we crank it, it cuts a piece of tissue. The knob on the back is telling us how thick our tissue is. So it's actually set at 5 microns right now. We're not going to cut that thin. We're going to I'm going to set it somewhere between 10 and 20 as I set up the tissue and start getting some sections. That way I'm not cutting really thick sections on it, but they're thick enough that I can test my anti-roll plate to see that it's in the right position. The other thing that we need to discuss is the actual tissue, because you can't see the tissue on here yet. The tissue is in our little block. This is the one that we put our tissue in that had the OCT solution. And then we brought it into the machine and we just set it inside the machine and let it freeze. So it took about an hour to freeze this properly. If I was going to cut a bunch of sections or a bunch of tissues, I might freeze 2 or 3 of them. Once you freeze them, you have to cut them. So the problem with the tissue is that this OCT, it's so thick that if you let your tissue sit in here over time, it will actually pull the water out of your tissue and your tissue will shrink. And now it won't be surrounded by OCT in here. And so every time you try to cut, your tissue falls apart. So you have to cut the ones that you freeze every single day. So keep that in mind. So we just use a single-sided razor blade like this, and there's always one sitting up on top. And you cut down the edges of the corners of this little block. They're very thin at this point, so you can just take your razor blade and make a little slice. And when you do that and you bend these back, your tissue block wants to come out. So now we're going to take this block and we're going to freeze it on one of these little things. Now there's 4 or 5 of these in the bottom of the machine. They're always cold. This is called the chuck. It's got ridges in it. We put OCT on this thing. We immediately put your block of tissue on there. And then there's a little compressing device in here. You won't be able to see it right now, but when you get ready to do this, it'll make sense. And it's very cold, and we put our block of tissue on the chuck, and we put it in there, and we compress the tissue block and the OCT. And what happens is the OCT gets in those little grooves, and it provides more adhesion to this chuck, because this is going to set in our machine here and go up and down. And we want to make sure that our block of tissue is stuck here so that you don't knock it off every time you try to make a slice. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. I'm going to try to do it handheld so you can see it. You won't be able to see it freeze, but you should be able to see the block of tissue. I'm going to go ahead and take it out of here. You'll be able to see the block of tissue freeze on to this surface. So, can you see this? Okay. All right. So I'm going to take some OCT. Now, this chuck is minus 18 degrees. So the OCT is going to freeze on here really rapidly. So I put a dime size blob on there. I take my tissue, put it down like that, and then I'm going to sit it down in here, and I'm going to put my little weighted device on there, and I'm going to let it sit for maybe 10 minutes. And that should be enough time for the OCT to freeze and for it to freeze your tissue block to the chuck.
A few moments later.
Okay, so I think that's enough time now. So what I'm going to do is I am going to take my block and I'm going to insert it into the chuck. And this knob at the top will tighten it inside. So now this block won't move. Now I'm being really careful when I do this because I have a blade right underneath this piece of glass and you can cut yourself. So you want to be really careful when you're doing this. Now, if I move this, it's several centimeters away from the actual blade. So what I want to do is I want to move this forward. Over here on the left-hand side are 2 buttons, and they have arrows on them, 1 arrow pointing backwards and 1 arrow pointing forwards. The arrow pointing backwards, when you push that and hold it, your tissue sample will move all the way back as far away from the blade as possible. And we normally do this in order to mount the blade carefully, in order to get your tissue in there so you're not right next to the blade. And then we use the bottom arrow key to bring the sample up close to the blade. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And you actually hold on to it. When you let off, it stops. And so you can hold on to it as you bring this closer. And you can see right now, I'm starting to cut on it a little bit. So I'm really close to my sample. The problem is it's cutting halfway through the face of this. So what I need to do now is I need to adjust the angle of my tissue. I need to take the top piece, I need to make the top piece move backwards so that the bottom part of this moves forwards a little bit, because it's actually cutting right in the middle. So there's a lever here that loosens this thing, and you can make little adjustments. So now you can see that I'm getting a cut, but now it's lower on the piece of tissue. So the first cut was cutting up here. The second cut is now cutting down here. So I want to move the top back a little bit further. So I'm going to loosen this, and I'm going to try to pull it back a little bit more, not too much, like that. Now I'm all out of whack. Let's see where we're at now. Now we're cutting at the bottom, but I think it's too far. So right there. Okay, so now I'm in here somewhere, and I think I've got it too close to the blade. And if I take this cut, I think I'm going to take a big chunk out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just move it back really, like one little step. And now I'm going to just crank forward for a while. Every turn is moving the sample closer. And so 10 minutes later, we will eventually get to where tissue will be coming off on the blade. All right, so now it's starting to come off on the blade. And you can see that every time I do this cut, it rolls, right? It's rolling up. We don't want it to roll up, and that's what the anti-roll plate does. Now, if you look, maybe you can see this on the film. We've been making cuts, but there's still a line basically that goes right across here. That was the very first one that I cut into it. And so it's going to be a while before we get this surface nice and flat, but that's okay. We're going to get little pieces of tissue, but we're only cutting right now. We're only cutting, looks like I have it set at 16 microns. So it's a pretty thin piece of tissue. So I'm going to just keep doing this, and I'm going to watch the surface of the tissue and watch for it to become nice and smooth. All right, so we're getting nice smooth cuts right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the big paintbrush that's in here. I'm going to clean off this surface. If you notice, I'm brushing away from the blade because I don't want to cut up my paintbrush and it will dull the blade. And so now I'm going to see what happens with my anti-roll plate the way in the position it's at. So I'm going to make a cut. And you can see that there's a piece of tissue underneath the anti-roll plate. When I pull this off, there it is. The first piece of it actually looks like it rolled up. So I still need to make some adjustments on my roll plate. And I think I need to bring it back a little bit. And you never really know until you play with it a little bit. All right, so that isn't working. Should work. All right, so there we go. All right, so there is a piece of cryo section. Now I'm looking at this and it doesn't look like I have any tissue in there yet. So I'm gonna cut a few more of these, get down into my tissue quite a ways. All right, now, so we really don't want 16 micron sections. For what we are using for this experiment, we need closer to 10. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to 10 microns. And I'll take a few sections here. All right. So there's a section. I want that section. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is I'll open up my anti-roll plate. Sometimes your tissue will stay on this surface. Sometimes it will be stuck on your anti-roll plate. It's actually really easier when it's stuck on the anti-roll plate, because you'll see as I reach up and grab one of my slides that's pre-labeled, normally when it's on the anti-roll plate, I can take my slide and I can just get it really close to my tissue and it will stick to the slide. When it's here, it's a little harder. Sometimes you feel like a contortionist trying to get your slide down to where the tissue will stick to it. But when you get close, because the slide is warm, the OCT will immediately melt and your tissue section will be on here. So there's the first tissue section. So now I want to make sure that I turn my slide over and I'm going to sit it back outside. So I turned it over, I'm going to sit it back outside and I'm going to get another section. So now that I have everything set, I'm going to grab my slide right away, open this up, and I'm going to get my second section on here. Now, what you want to make sure you do is you never overlap OCT and tissue. The worst thing that can happen is if you put your new piece of tissue on top of OCT from the previous tissue, because what will happen is when you go to stain this, it'll go into an aqueous solution and the OCT will dissolve, and that tissue section, if it's sitting on top of OCT, it'll float away. So you always want to make sure that there's at least a little bit of space in between each section. Now, this is an example of sometimes you'll go to make a cut and you won't get a good section. That's fine. Get rid of it, cut again. And there's another section. So now I'm going to be able to get 3 sections on this slide. So now I have 3 sections on this slide. This one is not going to be The last one isn't going to be a usable section because I can tell the OCT folded up underneath there, but that's okay. We've got 2 good ones on here. Now I take this slide and I put it up on my slide warmer and I move on to the next one. Every once in a while, brush this surface off, cut some more. Don't even want to mess with this one. It's out of whack. Get rid of it. Get another one. We have lots of tissue. Oh, that one's rolling up. Get rid of it. Three sections. When you are finished cutting all of your tissues, so you may be cutting 3 blocks of tissue this day. When you're all done, our lab, we remove the blade. We keep our blades in a blade box. It's the same blade box that I mentioned when we did the paraffin sections. So in fact, you'll see that we've got some blades in here. So generally we'll use a blade here. We might use it for maybe a couple of weeks, depending upon how much sectioning we do. And then we dispose of the blade, we get a new one. So you will remove the blade. You'll clean off this surface with a brush. When there's no blade in here, then you can clean it with ethanol. We have a squirt bottle of 100% ethanol. We don't want water in here because it'll make ice crystals. So if we use 100% ethanol on here, we can clean it really well. You do not want to do it when you have a blade in there. So make sure your blade's gone first. Now, our lab, we remove the glass plate and we save the glass plate in a little bag, and this bag stays in our cabinet locked. So every time you want to do vibratome or cryosectioning, you put a new glass plate, or you put this glass plate in here. So I want to talk a little bit about the glass plate. This is an extra one, so I want to show you something here. So here's our glass plate, okay? It's, I don't know, it's half a centimeter thick, maybe. There are 4 surfaces that you get to use for the anti-roll plate. So if we install it like this, you're actually using this surface on the top. What looks to you as it's the top of that plate. But there's another corner here. So you got a corner here and you've got a corner here. So if we put it in this way, we're using one surface. If we take it out and we turn it over, we're using a brand new surface. Then you can take the glass and turn it this way. Now, this is important because over time, the glass gets dinged up. Doesn't matter how careful you are, you will hit it on something. And when the glass is at minus 18 degrees Celsius, you will take little nicks out of the glass. When that happens, it doesn't work very well as an anti-roll plate. So we keep ours separate. That way, nobody else is using our glass plate. That just means that when you are planning to do your sectioning, you have to come in here. You're going to put your tissue section or your tissue samples in here to freeze. So at the same time, you put our glass plate in here and you put the blade in. And that way everything is cold when it's time to section your tissues. All right, we're talking about the cleanup though. Actually, let me mention this glass plate, you can see it's way wider than our tissue was. Actually, so is our blade. This whole thing moves. So this little lever here loosens this up so it can slide from side to side. And so you can actually start cutting on one side of the blade using one piece of the glass plate. If it starts to get dinged up or the blade starts to get dull, you just move it and you do some more sections, and then you move it and you do some more sections. So this gives you several options when you're sectioning. Okay. The rest of the cleanup involves making sure that there's no paraffin in here. So you want to make sure that after you've taken the chuck out, you make sure that you clean off any paraffin that might be on here. You look down behind where your blade is, and you make sure you get all of the paraffin off of that. Now, you would normally be doing this with your blade removed, but I'm going to do it with the blade in there, and hopefully I don't cut my hand off. But this tray in here actually comes out. And so you can pull that tray out, dump the paraffin in the trash can, and put the tray back in, or the OCT, and then put your tray back in. The other thing that you do is after you're done and you take your tissue off, you can take the chuck out of here, go to the bench, let it sit for a couple of minutes on the bench. You'll have your block on there. You're done for the day. You can't use that block anymore. If you don't cut any more tissue samples, you're done because it won't last. So I always say the more slides you cut, the better. When you're all done, you're going to actually let this warm for just a few minutes, and then you're going to take your razor blade and you're going to cut through between the chuck and your sample. You're going to cut that and it'll pop off. Then you're going to take these forceps that are always sitting, they're either inside of here or they're sitting up on top of the surface. You're going to take these and you're going to actually clean out. I'll try to do it left-handed. I'll really mess this up. You're going to clean out the grooves. So you're going to take and you're going to run this through the grooves, and you're going to actually get OCT out of this. That's important because if you have an OCT embedded in this, you're not going to be able to hold your sample to the chuck. So you really got to clean these grooves out. It just needs to get a little warmer. So you just put it on the bench for a couple of minutes, cut off your block, dig those out, and then you take the chuck and you put it back in the machine. Finish by turning off the light. Close up. We always leave it on. It's always cold and ready to go. And that's cryosectioning.